slightly beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls and to the Christian Bible, you highlight the role of politics and how that contributed to how the Bible came together. There is a fascinating section. You have a fascinating section and a very nice infographic, and I know Christine will be showing this, about how, for example, 3 non-Christian kings, one became Christian only later, what role they had to play a role in the formation of the Bible. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, if you look at the infographic, you'll see that there are 2 kings that eventually led to the writing of the Old Testament, and one emperor, Constantine, who led to the writing of the New Testament. And that is quite a fascinating thing to notice. And I notice it only because I was asking myself the very question. And in fact, it's in page 53, and we can see infographic on page 53. You'll notice, for example, that there are 3 sections in that infographic: politics in the Bible, how 3 non-Jewish kings initiated the writing of the Bible, and then interpretation defines authority. Politics has always been part of every religion we know. And the reason is because politics is not a good or a bad thing. It is a thing. It's how humans begin to live the moment civilizations came about. What about religion? Why is religion important? The word religio in Latin simply means to bind together. So religion originally was the idea of binding people together with a common belief. Why is a common belief important? People were afraid of thefts and cheats. If someone cheats you, how do you know that the person will be punished with justice and all that? By appealing to a higher power. So the idea of God became very important very early on in human civilization. So politics was very much part of it. Economics is also very much part of it because we all had to pay our bills. So for me as a scholar, I had to see the relationship between what I call EPR, economics, politics, and religion. How do they interact? How does it flow? When I studied archaeology at Oxford, one of the things that I studied was what's called the Iron Age religions. And Iron Age is in the Palestine area was about 1200 BC. The writings state this: every known religion in the ancient Near East, if you want to be a leader, a political leader, you must always build 2 buildings. You must always build a palace and you must build a temple. Without these 2 buildings, no one's going to pay attention to you. Every king, going back to the pharaohs, are afraid of one thing. They're afraid of revolt. They're afraid of someone killing them to take over. Why would they do that? They would do that because you're only king as long as you give benefit to the people. Otherwise, you've got to keep on being a dictator, and it's very tedious being a dictator. Now, coming back then to how politics plays a role in the Bible, you have King Artaxerxes II of Persia. Then you've got Pharaoh Ptolemy II of Egypt, and you've got Emperor Constantine of Rome. In each case, they wanted to find out what is this thing called the writing of the Jewish people. The Jewish people, they're very small in number, but their great contribution is not in buildings. It's not in art. It's not in statuary. For example, the Greeks, they have a great philosophy. You've got the Romans, Greco-Roman, they have buildings, they have building empires. The Greek left one thing. They left the sacred scriptures, the Bible. It was so important to many people coming across Palestine that over and over again, the kings wanted that. Well, partly it is the idea that writing is power. Partly it's the concept that you see the human hand, you see either a papyrus or a skin, you put marks on it, and these marks can mean something to another person far away even after you die. That was magical. Writing was a magical achievement of the human mind. Before writing came along, if I know something and I tell my son or my daughter how to catch animals and how to feed themselves, once I'm gone forever. My thoughts are gone forever. That person has to take that to pass it to a new generation. After writing, everything changed. You now have these marks. These marks will transform the way we live. So writing became very important. The curious thing is both the Christian world and the Jewish world at the time did not think very much about writing an official version until these 3 kings began to ask for these questions. And why did they ask for it? They wanted the Holy Grail. And for example, you find in Indiana Jones stories, they want the official Holy Grail. The one that's probably the most important is Constantine in 325, when he called a council, because he have all these disagreeing parts of Christianity all over the empire, and he wants them to say, let's do one thing. And by the way, since we're onto this, just want to make a plug for the year 2025 in Istanbul. There will be a celebration of the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea that gave us the Nicene Creed that most churches today will repeat in the sermon. And I plan to be there myself. That is when the hope is to get all the patriarchs of the different denominations of the church, the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Church, the Protestant churches, to come together. And the hope is that we'll find unity in our beliefs and our practices rather than just division going back to 325 AD. Now, in terms of the last panel, interpretation defines authority. Just want to say that for the longest time in my own Christian walk, I became an adult believer in 1976. And I've always thought that the idea of what we now call inerrancy, the idea that the Bible is fixed and it has everything historically and scientifically matching, is the way to go. It didn't occur to me that that's quite a new thing. That's a 20th century preoccupation. And it's largely an American thing. The British are not so concerned about this. The British are concerned about reliability of the Bible. They're not concerned about verbatim matching of the Bible, partly because there are already so many verbatims, so to speak. We have so many versions of the Bible. So, and we know one thing, every time a preacher or Sunday school teacher or cell group leader teaches the Bible, they are interpreting it. They are almost rewriting it. They're trying to make it match the context of the listeners. They want to make it make sense. The writers of the Bible were not doing anything different. When you read Paul, for example, or Peter or John, when they were writing, they are all doing one thing. They are reinterpreting the Old Testament for a New Testament crowd. Because they know the Old Testament stuff has happened. So much has happened. The Assyrian exile, the Babylonian exile, the Persian return, then the Greco-Roman, the Hellenistic period. Jesus' time was a Roman period. Caesar Augustus was there. They have to write something that matches the concerns of that period. Today, every pastor is doing that at every sermon on every Sunday, because our concerns today are our geohistorical context. So that's what they do. So in that context, chapter 6 in the book that identifies this, I just want to mention that don't think Christianity or Judaism is a standalone project. It has always been stimulated by, and it affects the greater world. And that's why people who study literature will tell you, in the terms of literature, the Bible is the single most important influence in human thought. That's how, and these are not Christians talking about this. These are people acknowledging the power, not so much that the Bible has supernatural powers per se, but the writing has been around for so long. It has influenced writers like Dante Alighieri in his Divine Comedy. It has so influenced Shakespeare. It has influenced John Milton. It has influenced just about anyone we can think of, not just in the English-speaking world, but in the world of Latin literature. And now, of course, around the world, because someone said the largest number of English students in the world is in China. Many of the Chinese want to learn English. What do they want to study in English? A lot of them take literature. When you take Shakespeare, or even Jane Austen for that matter, you don't have a choice but to say, what is this thing called the Bible? They're all referring to it. They're all referring to the scripture. They refer to church. When you read any kind of novel, 19th century, it's constantly about church on a Sunday, and there's always a vicar somewhere, there's a pastor somewhere. So you cannot understand the world of the English world or the world of the Western world without understanding what is this thing called the Bible, right? So anyway, that's the part about the influence of politics. It's incredible influence. And I just wanted to highlight that in the book.
Now, I want to turn to a major theme in your book. The subtitle of your book is Science and the Discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, you take it for granted that science and religion mutually influence one another, that technology and sacred scripture are invested in each other. That is, however, not what I would say an average religious person may view science today. Science and religion have a fraught relationship today. So, can you clarify why science is so relevant? In fact, not just relevant, maybe that's not the best word. It is so internal, intrinsic to religion itself, and specifically to the Judeo-Christian faith and the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay. When you look at science and the Dead Sea Scrolls specifically, and then to the Bible more broadly, and then to religion as a whole, you'll find that nothing stays the same. Nothing is static. It is dynamic. Not that it's changed completely, but it keeps on evolving. Our understanding evolves. When I was younger, I used to ask this question: if God is God, why didn't God just put into our brain some kind of logic chip that the moment I'm born, I know all I need to know about God and the Bible? Because learning is tedious. It's a hassle. You and I have been to school, we've been to Sunday school, we made a choice to make our intellectual life one of the Bible, right? We have both done the master's degrees, we have both done the PhD. Mine took 9 years because it's PhD in science and theology. Why invest such a huge amount of my time and intellectual energy on something called the Bible? And then you realize, well, we can't ask God why, but we know that is how it panned out. This is how it is, which means if there's a God and God knows what's going on, this is the method of God. This is how God wants us to know about God's self through the evolution of thought and method. The question you might ask then is, how are they invested in each other? Let me start with science. What we call experimental science is about 400 years old. Before that, was there still science? Yes, they were non-experimental science. Scientia in Latin simply means knowledge. That's all it means. But what's important about experimental science? It's its universality. You can take the same information that blue and yellow always becomes green. You can take it to any culture, any place, any lab in the world, we get exactly the same information. That is the power of science. Science does not give truth. Science does not give anything that is spiritual. Science is a good test that your spiritual claims are tenable. So that's important. It's a great tool. It's a terrible master, right? Science is. So when you look at what is a role that science is and why it emerged, historians of science have noted of all the cultures in the world, we have the great Chinese culture. We've got the great Mediterranean culture on the eastern side of Mesopotamia, Egypt. Modern science came about only in Christendom, only in the Christian West. And for a long time, I was studying philosophy of time at Princeton. I was asking why. My personal reason is because in order to conduct experiments, you need a permanent past that's gone forever. You need an incoming future that's rolling up, and you need a present that's constantly moving. And the Abrahamic religions have that kind of linear time. The Eastern religions tend to have a cyclical time, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or Jainism. When you have a cyclical time, you can't tell whether this has happened before. It's a time loop problem. But apart from that, Peter Harrison from Brisbane University, he wrote a couple of books, was very instrumental. He did his research on why did science emerge? Why did Francis Bacon want to have experiments? And it's surprising. The real reason wasn't because they were just curious. They were trying to do God's work in their mind. They felt that if the story of Adam and Eve rings true, they believed Adam had the complete knowledge that God has given to the human race. But Adam lost it because of sin. And the goal of modern humans, when he say modern, he means himself. The goal of 16th, 17th, 18th century humans is to recover the lost knowledge of Adam. Now, we're not here to discuss whether they were correct or wrong. We are looking at the impetus, the reason why they wanted to do that. So in order to even embark on a scientific enterprise, you need two very strong spiritual assumptions that you cannot prove by science or mathematics. You need to assume that there's order in the universe. This sounds very simple. There's no reason why there should be, none at all. Philosophically, no reason can be given why the universe must be ordered and not chaotic. But in the book of Genesis, it begins by telling you there was chaos and then now there's order, right? Whoever wrote the Genesis text was very clever. He was aware that in the ancient world, everything looks very chaotic. They don't know why things happen. They don't know why the average lifespan is 35 to 40. They do not know why that you get ill and you die. They do not know why the earth moved. They do not know why floods happen on a regular basis until the mathematicians worked out how to calculate time. The early bottleneck people in South Africa, we think were the first people to count time by looking at the stars to see patterns in the sky so that they know how the tides work. When they know the tides, they know how to wait for low tide, going to catch the mussels to eat, and then escape the tide as it comes along. All these sort of stuff are endlessly fascinating for me. They're all scientific, but they refer to a spiritual quest. So we can begin to know one thing. Science would not have happened the way we understand it if there wasn't a context of a Christian belief in the Christian idea of a God, because order is a very dramatic thing. The second assumption is that the intelligibility of the universe, the assumption that the human mind can understand. Now, again, that sounds very interesting because a lot of religions kind of seem to say that, but the Hebrew religion, going back to maybe 1000 BC, was among the first to make this assumption. It's an amazing thing to think that the feeble human mind can one day understand this. I grew up in the 1960s. I remember in July, I think 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. It was a shattering blow to many Eastern religions who believed that there was a god or goddess living on the moon. No one expected someone to check it out. Well, it happened in 1969, very interesting. But what happened for me personally was to see that man went to the moon, I puzzled over it. I said, how did we get so smart? How did we, the mind of the person who did that, or the people who did that, it's the same mind as mine. And then you found the power was in collective learning. Humans alone, after we learn to read and write, we learn to collect all our data together and we improve upon what we know from the past. So the famous Sir Isaac Newton mentioned when someone asked him how he got so smart. And he said, because we stand on the shoulders of giants who came before us. We stand on that. In the Christian world, it's not very different. You and I, André, our understanding of the Bible was because they were based on the labors of people who came before us. We're hopefully improving on it. We're hopefully trying to sort of sweep away the theological cobwebs that were encrusted, mostly from economics and politics, but not from faith. So that's part of what it's doing. So here I mentioned how science came out of the Christian religion very specifically. It's a very daunting claim, and it could be a fighting claim because others might say, that sounds very arrogant. Well, I welcome anyone to do a check on the history of science, and you'll find it very clearly. The early scientists, they believed in God. They wanted to do the work of God because they felt they were trying to undo the damage that Adam did. They believed there was a physical one person called Adam and all that. The reverse. How does religion help science? Well, let me turn to archaeology very briefly. And in an upcoming book on Mesopotamia, Science and the Bible, I lay out how did modern archaeology begin. Archaeology began as the quest to prove the Bible, believe it or not. In the 19th century, late 19th century, the British clerics, in fact, the first few true modern archaeologists were clerics. They were Bible people. They said to themselves, we have been worshiping, believing in God who was in Israel so many hundreds of miles away. Shouldn't we go and find out what's going on? And that's what they did. They did a survey. Now, in light of this, as they went to find out more, it was only possible with several inventions. Invention of the steam engine, the invention of the telegraph, where you can send information back and forth. Without all these inventions, you just couldn't safely do archaeology. And that's why early archaeology wasn't done for over 1,000 years, because it was too dangerous to go that far. We had no instruments. If they dug things up, they didn't know what they were. Now today, like when I just came back 2018 from Megiddo, Armageddon, where excavated there in Israel, I saw a human bone. I picked it up. I took my iPhone. I took a video of it. Can you believe this? I have in my hand a video proof that I picked up a bone that was not seen by human eyes in 2,700 years. I put it into a clear plastic bag. I labeled it. Someone came along, took a photograph of me labeling it, and then they countersigned it. Now we know that bone that I picked it up, first time I saw it. I started videoing before the bone was fully out of the ground, right? That is now taken to a lab in Israel. Then after they analyze it, they send it to a lab in Germany to counter-check. When that's done, they send it to Moscow to countersign, and then finally to London. There are 4 countries that will check to see that this is correct. That's the rigor of modern archaeology. All of that would not be possible without religion and science working hand in hand. And then I remember I asked my first excavation, 1997, I asked the leader of excavation, how do you know where to dig in Israel? They all look alike to me. They're just ground and sand. And then he says, oh, we check the Bible. I said, really? He said, yeah. So I said, are you a Christian or a Jewish believer? I said, no, I'm an atheist. But if you want to do any excavation, you check the Bible because they tell you where things were. And they are normally off by a bit here and there because they have no GPS, no satellite, but it's substantially there. Sometimes they get it wrong, but a lot of times that's where it is. So take away the Bible, you do not have modern archaeology. That's a shocking thing to even think about. Not just biblical archaeology, archaeology as a whole, partly because the methods of modern archaeology came out of biblical archaeology. I could go on and on, but it's in a book about the interplay between these two, science and the Bible. If you take one away, it's really very hard to have the development of modern science as we know today, from its early beginnings.
Now, time is slipping by really quickly, so I want to get at least a few questions in that I think are important. You know, we have successive scientific discoveries. Can you give examples of how they have enriched theology and even our interpretation of God?
Okay, the one that comes to mind, which I wrote a lot about, is optics. The invention of the telescope and the microscope in the 17th century. Before the microscope was invented, we didn't know there were invisibles that the human eye cannot see. So we read about when Paul wrote in the New Testament about the invisibilities, things we cannot see. We were surprised. Now, in terms of the telescope, the first person who refined a telescope about 10x, 10 times, to actually see the sky was Galileo Galilei in 1609. When he looked at the sky, he saw 4 of the moons of Jupiter. And it was just a stunning thing because he didn't know they moved. No one knew. They thought the lights were just decoration that God put up there, right? And early thinkers, they refer to as the first heaven, the second heaven. The first heaven is where the birds fly. The second heaven is where the luna might be, the moon might be, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and then your 7th heaven. The invention of the microscope and telescope transformed the way we interpret the Bible now. In the past, it was all about us. By the 19th century, there were actually clerics, believe it or not, who entertained the idea of UFOs. What we call UFOs, but they simply thought of as other beings that God could have created outside of our planet. That's a stunning thing. And I'm still going through some of the early writings. They didn't have the Hubble telescope we have today. They don't have the James Webb telescope that just went online not so long ago. They don't have anyone arriving in Mars. Now we have China arrived in Mars. The US has sent probes to Mars, discovered water sources. There are all kinds of things that are amazing. Now, genetics that came about in the 1950s, it also transformed the way we think about how disease are inherited and passed on. What does that mean for the Christian faith? Well, it affects the idea of healing. It affects the idea of how does God heal? Does God heal only through what we call miracles, or also through the intervention of medical professionals, healthcare? COVID-19 is such a stunning game changer. In living memory, COVID-19 came along. Doctors and nurses and pharmaceuticals immediately knew what was happening. Most of us in the clerical world are catching up. Most of us in the religious world are catching up. Most of us in the world of the church are catching up, because in one fell swoop, this tiny thing that we don't even know whether it's a living thing, because it's just a mass of protein in the lipid frame, has stopped worship in every known religion on the planet. And we can't even see it. It's an invisible thing. Now, in the book, I talk about the evolution of the word virus. The virus first came out, the word virus came out as simply a Latin for the word poison, because they realized that this thing that they cannot see is killing bacteria. And many were wondering, how can anything kill bacteria when we can't even see what it is? It's so much tinier. And then eventually, by the 21st century, we now use the word virus for even computer viruses. A virus of the mind that Dawkins talked about when he refers to religion. So the word virus, the same word has been used over time by different interpretations because we understand what it means differently. Now, in terms of specific enrichment of the Christian faith, geohistorically is one good example. If not for modern geology, if not for plate tectonics and stuff like that, that we call modern science, we wouldn't know where to go to find things. So for example, when Captain James Cook is the one I want to mention in circumnavigation. Captain James Cook in the 1700s made 3 circumnavigations of the globe. Now he, like most British sailors in those days, were very conservative Christians. They were very, when I say conservative, I don't mean in the modern 20th century sense. What I meant conservative Christians was that in that context, they wanted to really make sure that they understood God and the revelation in the Bible and not add new things to it, conserve it in that context. He went across the world and was shocked that there were so many places where humans lived because it wasn't mentioned in the Bible. And there was struggle between what's a pagan and what's a savage, right? A pagan is someone with the wrong religion, so you convert the pagan. A savage is someone who is subhuman, so you can enslave them. Very interesting. The history of slavery partly was influenced by this distinction between a savage and a pagan. Now, we know that Captain Cook didn't come back after his third voyage. He died in Hawaii. He was killed. And the question was, why was he killed in Hawaii? And part of the reason was, when he arrived in Hawaii, they were starving. They were running out of food. But they believed in a God that would come from the sea and had white hair. Here was Captain Cook with his white wig sailing on a massive ship. There were several ships, right? To them, he was their God. And he didn't kind of tell them that he really wasn't a God because he realized they were giving him food, hoping that by offering food to this God, they can get more food in return. And eventually he got frustrated with them because they were getting frustrated. They couldn't get food and they started stealing. And the stealing, it was a cultural thing. In the West, they thought property is mine and you're stealing my stuff. In the islands, they thought we share everything. So I'm just borrowing for a season. And partly a misunderstanding, cultural, it ended up in his death. But his writings, his journals really went back to England and shaped Christian theology dramatically because he reported seeing things that was not mentioned in the Bible. And people kept asking, wait a minute, so the Bible is not as comprehensive as we thought. Yes, it's not as comprehensive as we thought. In fact, if you read Romans, even though by Paul's time, Alexander the Great had already gone as far as modern Pakistan, yet when he writes rhetorically as a trained Roman rhetoric, he told the Romans, your faith is known throughout all the world. Now, if we read it today, we'll say, he means all the world. No, he doesn't. He doesn't know what all the world is. That's why they call the New World, North and West and South America. It was just unknown to them. They didn't know what was going on. Anyway, so that's the importance of how, this is just an example of how science can really transform and enrich the way we understand God in context. You'll find more of it in an upcoming book, actually. If Christine can show the cover of the book, it's called Mesopotamia, Science and Bible, in the Bible, where I talked about, it's an infographic, a black infographic that tells you, okay, yeah, this is the book that's coming up. I think probably end of this month or middle of this month. So look for that, where we'll look at some artifacts. And this, I had the assistance of Danny Lee and Christine Leong in doing this. But can we have the other infographic of science and technology? Andre, were there any specific things you wanted to ask about the enrichment of theology and interpretation? Oh, that's the one, right? So that's the infographic that's in the other book that I found very, very interesting. Some of them includes on the lower right, the discovery in 2003 of the Indonesian hobbits. The hobbits are very fascinating because in 2003, Australian and Indonesian excavators in the island of Flores. Flores is a Catholic island of Indonesian archipelago. More than 95% are Roman Catholics. But there, they found these strange humans. They're about 3 feet tall, but their feet are about the size of a modern adult feet of 5'7". So that's why they nicknamed them the hobbits. The locals remember them as the orang pendek, the short people. Now, we don't know whether they still exist in the forest on Florida, no idea. But they found this skeleton. Today it's called Liang Bua Satu, the first of 12 skeletons found. We think it's a female. Normally you look at female to see if they've given birth. The pelvic bones are normally cracked a bit. They look at the relative size of the brain case to determine whether it is considered human or ape, normally 600 cc brain case. In any case, the discovery of that was a series of shocking discoveries that goes back to 1974 when Don Johanson in Ethiopia discovered Lucy afarensis. And Lucy is a half human, half ape. How do we deal with that in the Christian world? But here's a shocking thing that's interesting. All the discoveries of human fossils and human bones to date had its granddaddy in the 1960s with a guy called Louis Leakey of England. And Louis Leakey was a son of a missionary. And his goal was to discover Adam. Again, it was the spiritual quest that led to scientific discoveries. I want to close with another one called Peking Man and Java Man. These are two found in Java and Peking. And in both cases, when the archaeologists came from the Netherlands and from England and America, they believed that the earliest humans must come from Asia because Asia is such old culture. So they wanted to find basically the earliest Adam, so to speak. And then they found these fossils. But in both books, you'll find examples, more and more examples, how science really transformed the way we understand and theology. Oh, final one, which I should have mentioned earlier on. I did mention briefly the carbon-14 dating systems, that for the first time in the 1960s, every museum in the world for the first time can start dating organic material. Before that, you couldn't date. You just take for granted that it must be an estimate of how long, but no way to test it. So that was an incredible achievement of the sciences to enrich theology.